Welcome to this Keble London lecture. There are some in this audience who don't know me. I'm the Warden, Jonathan Phillips. And those of you who don't know me are contributing, I have to say, and I'm very, very angry about it, to an even larger audience at this lecture. In fact, it's the largest audience we've had at a London lecture than at my own. So that's very, very, very disappointing. But of course, on another level, it is hardly surprising, because for those of you who do know Ian Archer, who should have been, when one thinks of his title tonight, The Transformation of London, giving the first of our London lectures, but anyway, better late than never. Ian is a college treasure, and perhaps in the modern vernacular, and those of you here who are his more recent students can confirm whether I'm using this language correctly, he's a legend. There you are, I'm using it correctly. We shall see. Ian and I have a particular relationship because he was sub-warden in the period in which I was being recruited, selected, elected, or whatever. So for those of you who think that that was a category of error which cannot be forgiven, Ian is the man. I personally am delighted and deeply in his debt. He's been a fellow of the college since 1991. He knows more about it than anybody else. I say that with ever such slight hesitation, because of course he was joint author with my predecessor of Keble Past and Present, and anyone in the room who is not the proud owner of that volume of the college's history should be aware that there are plenty more available in certainly not. And I am not going to give you the rest of his very distinguished academic CV, because he will be talking to you tonight about something which is actually at the heart of it as a historian of London. But not only is he a Keble treasure and a Keble legend, he's also very much, as a historian in another of the great Keble traditions, an innovator. And for those of you who want to see proof of that, one of his most recent collaborations, which is really groundbreaking, is the parallel online edition of the Holinshed Chronicles. But he is the author of much, much more. We're going to have a splendid lecture tonight. Before I hand over, just some brief thanks to Herbert Smith Freehills for this venue. I was going to be thanking Susanna Cogman as our host, but she has been dragged away by a client. James Quinney, I don't actually know whether James is in the room as I speak, but James was in the drinks reception beforehand. We are very grateful to them for this wonderful facility. And I was not expecting to see, though I'm of course delighted to see, Jonathan Mills here, and would want to thank him for his continuing sponsorship of this series of lectures. So I don't know, Jonathan, where you're sitting just at the moment, but thank you very much. And being typically modest, you're not even indicating. Oh, there, thank you. But as I said, perhaps we give a little round of applause to Ian to encourage him on his way.
Well, thank you very much, Warden, and welcome everybody. It is marvellous to see so many of you, so many good friends, and so many sparring partners of yesteryear. I'm very worried by this sort of front row grouping, which is a realisation of one of my nightmares, I suppose. But anyway, but I suppose they're within striking distance. Now, of course, I'm a historian, and historians do tend to deal in facts. So there are going to be a few facts. I'm starting with some facts. Population. In 1550, London had a population of about 75,000. It was ranked number 6 in terms of size on the European city league tables. Naples had a population of 212,000, Venice about 160,000, Paris 130,000, all much bigger. And London, interestingly, was still smaller than it had been in 1300, when its population was probably between 80 and 100,000. It had shrunk dramatically after the Black Death to about 40,000 people. But in 1550, it stands on the threshold of a remarkable population expansion. 200,000 by 1600, doubling again by 1650 to 400,000, and then in the later 17th century, growing to about 575,000 by 1700. Its fastest rate of growth was actually in the later 16th century, but what's striking is its ability to sustain growth in the later 17th century through what was a period of population stagnation, indeed modest decline in England overall in the later 17th century. So London is, as it were, bucking the national trend. And this growth pushes London up those European league tables. By 1600, it's ranked number 3, after Naples and Paris. By 1650, it's second only to Paris. Paris had a population then of about 430,000. But by 1700, probably actually around 1680, London overtook Paris. 1700, London's population, as I said, was 575,000. Paris, probably about 500,000. And of course, its delighted contemporaries, this was metropolitan boosterism, 17th century style. 1687, the widely disseminated Angliae Notitia. This is one of these texts that goes through editions every year. It celebrates London as the largest and most populous, the fairest and most opulent city at this day in all Europe, perhaps in the whole world, surpassing Paris and Rome put together. Well, that was actually garbage. Of course, there is a sense in which they kind of, in these sorts of comparisons, they do always forget Beijing, Constantinople, and Edo, which were all rather bigger cities at that point. Edo, Beijing probably had populations of about 1 million at that point. So that's another story. But London's population growth was outstripping national population growth. So that means that the proportion of the population of England that were living in London was growing. About 3% in 1550, 5% in 1600, 10% in 1670, 12% in 1700. And London accounts for a very high share of the overall English urban population. London accounts for 2/3 of the English urban population living in settlements of over 5,000 in the early 17th century. So demographic expansion was accompanied by changes, obviously, in the topography of the city. The earliest maps of London show a compact city, clearly definable from its agrarian hinterland. The city is still defined by its walls with a narrow ring of suburbs. The city proper needs to be distinguished from the nuclei of growth in Westminster and Southwark. Suburban development is most evident in the western suburbs, which for a long time had been attractive for the residents of magnates. But at that time, the Strand was just a narrow thread of building linking the City of London and Westminster. The northwestern suburbs were fairly well developed, but elsewhere the development is just, as it were, ribbon development along the roads leading out of the city. In Southwark, again, buildings cluster around the bridgehead and along the roads leading into Kent and Surrey. But we can see the potential for growth in some of those green spaces that are apparent even within the walls. By the 1680s, the definition provided by the city walls and the ditch has gone. The degree of differentiation between the constituent elements of the metropolis has been eroded, with much denser building in the West End. Building is continuous from Piccadilly in the west to Limehouse in the east. As Daniel Defoe put it, London now included all that vast mass of buildings reaching from Blackwall in the east to Tothill Fields in the west, and all the new buildings by and beyond Hanover Square. Now, what I want to do in the course of the talk today is to say a bit about, initially about contemporary reactions to this growth, and then to look for the bulk of the talk at the reasons for London's growth, and perhaps at the end to ask some questions about the international comparisons, why it is that London edges ahead of its international competitors. Now, it has to be said that contemporaries, at least at the beginning of the period, felt very uneasy about this phenomenal growth. London, as it were, as the centre of the English universe, could be seen as problematic. Contemporaries often saw London's position as distorting and disfiguring, and they drew regularly on these sort of bodily images of as it were, deformed bodies. London might well be the belly, or if you will, the head of England, claimed Thomas Digges in Parliament in 1585. But he added the extremities, the legs and hands, had to live, and they were being impoverished. Peter Heylin expatiated on the theme further in 1652. Great towns in the body of the state are like the spleen in the body natural, the monstrous growth of which impoverisheth all the members, by drawing to it all the animal and vital spirits which should give nourishment unto them, and in the end, cracked or surcharged by its own foulness, not only sends unwholesome fumes and vapours unto the head and body, unto the head, and heavy pangs unto the heart, but draws a consumption unto itself. So deformity, disease, and corruption. And these sentiments are very often articulated in the later 16th and 17th century. And they're sentiments of, there's elements of rant about them, but they're politically important sentiments because they they fuel the anxieties of the provincial towns who feel that they have been squeezed out by London's dominance and competition. So you get these sentiments articulated regularly in Parliament. But there are alternative voices, and they become more insistent over the course of the 17th century. So for Edmund Howes, writing in 1615, we have a celebration of the city as a commercial emporium. London is a city filled more abundantly with all sorts of silks, fine linen, oils, wines and spices, perfection of arts, and all costly ornaments and curious workmanship than any other province. So as London well deserves to bear the name of the choicest storehouse of the world. Edward Davenant, one of the early political economists, writing in the Restoration, asks the question whether there was any truth in the notion that the growth of the city was pernicious to England, that the kingdom was like a rickety body with a head too big for the other members. But Davenant denies that. The growth of the city is advantageous to the nation. And of course, Daniel Defoe agrees. Those people are greatly mistaken who pretend the growing greatness of London is too much for the whole country, alleging that the city draws away the nourishment from the country like a dropsy which swells the body, but draws away the nourishment away from the extreme parts. For Defoe, the truth is opposite. As every part of the kingdom sends up hither the best of their produce, so they carry back a return of wealth. The money flows from the city into the remotest parts and furnishes them again to increase that produce, to improve the lands, pay rent to the landlords, taxes to their governors, and supply their families with necessaries. And this is trade. So the question one has is, one level, London can be seen as parasitic on the rest of the country. At another level, it can be seen as a stimulus to economic development. Where does the truth lie? Now, London, of course, is certainly a devourer of people. Because its mortality levels were very high, the city lacks the capacity to produce itself, to reproduce itself. And it's dependent, absolutely dependent on migration. And it's estimated that in the later 17th century, London needs 8,000 migrants a year to sustain the levels of growth that it was it was experiencing. And London at that point, remember, national population is stagnating in the later 17th century. London is creaming off the majority of the natural increase of the population, and indeed it's contributing to that demographic slowdown because of course its mortality levels are so much higher than elsewhere. But we have to ask the question about, obviously, why are people coming to London? Was it, as it were, the push factor of the inadequate living they could make in rural society as real wages were falling in the century after 1550? That's the period when population is increasing. Are they essentially subsistence migrants in search of casual labour and charitable handouts? Or was London's growth supplied by streams of what we might call betterment migrants, upwardly mobile people in search of new skills and contacts? Now, you might think from much of the government rhetoric, the government fulminations about the swarms of idle persons and vagrants flocking to the city, one might think that this is migration of people on the margins of subsistence. And there is, of course, an element of truth in that. In difficult decades like the 1590s, that undoubtedly people are brought to the city for that reason, and there are big problems. But I do think that the growth of the city is largely through what one might call betterment migration. It's interesting that we know that in the mid-16th century, obviously when London's much smaller, it's needing about 1,400 male migrants to sustain its growth. And we know that there were 1,250 apprenticeships in the mid-16th century. So apprenticeship then is accounting for a very high proportion of the overall migration scheme. And apprentices tend to be more literate, and also because of the premiums that are associated with apprenticeship contracts, this tends to mean that we're getting people from at least the middling, disproportionately as it were, from the middling sections of society. And what about women? What about female migrants? Because there were a lot of those too. It's been shown that in the early 17th century, only 3/4 of the people who were giving testimony, it's been shown that 3/4 of the people giving testimony in the church courts were born outside of the city. So a lot of female immigration as well. Why are they coming? Well, we get something from the literary stereotype. Samuel Rowlands has a fictional character, Country Nan, who leaves the milkmaid lasses she'd grown up with, coming to London very neat and deft to seek preferment and her fortunes raise, being indeed, as all the parish says, a handsome wench and likely to do well, if with a London mistress she might dwell. Now, there are some established facts here, though. We can go beyond literary stereotypes. Wages for maidservants in London are higher than in the provinces. It's also the case that marriage prospects for migrant women were probably better in London than they were in the provinces, because London has a skewed sex ratio. Because of all those apprentices, there are lots of, as it were, eligible men, and that means that women, as it were, with fairly modest dowries, could make upwardly mobile matches. So it looks like we can talk about betterment migration there too. So what was it then that drew these people to London? Why was the city growing? And the answer lies in two elements of London's vision. They're rather obvious in many ways. The cities that grow in early modern Europe are essentially capital cities and ports, and London is both. And I'm going to look at its role as a capital city to begin with, and then look at its role as a port. And in thinking about its role as a as a capital city, I'm going to kind of structure my remarks around the commentary of a contemporary Giovanni Botero, who wrote a tract on the causes of the greatness of cities. And he's pretty astute. I mean, you can apply his insights to London. He wrote that it doth infinitely avail to the magnifying and making cities great and populous to have the residency of the prince therein. For where the prince is resident, there also the parliaments are held, and the supreme place of justice is kept. All matters of importance have recourse to that place. All princes and all persons of account, ambassadors of princes and of commonweals, make their repair thither. All such as aspire and thirst after offices and honours run thither, overcome with emulation and disdain at others. Thither are the revenues brought that appertain unto the state, and there they are dispersed out again. Now, it has to be said, of course, that to be a capital city, we think of capital cities as centres of armies of civil servants, but of course the English state is very small. In the 16th century, it's probably only employing about 800 civil servants around Westminster. Over the course of the 17th century, the civil service grows, particularly with what we call the growth of the fiscal military state, all those excise officers and so on. You've probably got about 2,700 by the 1690s. But the other element in the picture, of course, is the royal court. And the royal court in the 16th century kind of abandons its peripatetic role, moving around the country, and becomes much more fixed in London and the palaces around London. Obviously not just in Whitehall, but Greenwich and Hampton Court and so on. So the court is a key element, I'm arguing, in the city economy. And Whitehall Palace here is, of course, the centre of all this. Because Whitehall is a bit of a mess in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's developed piecemeal since the reign of Henry VIII. It was described by a French visitor. Of course, they had better palaces, obviously, the Louvre, Versailles. But so they come and they look at Whitehall, and it's totally ramshackle. It's typical of English inefficiency. It's ill built and nothing but a heap of houses erected at diverse times and of different models, which they made contiguous in the best manner they could for the residence of the court. When it was burned down in 1698. Saint-Simon, sort of another of these French observers recorded that the largest and ugliest palace in Europe had been removed. But Whitehall, of course, is really a miniature town of itself. The court under Elizabeth employs 600 or 700 staff, and of course they've all got their own little servants under them. By Charles I's reign, that's doubled. The palace in 1670 had over 1,500 rooms set aside for lodgings. It was noted in 1634 that the court was filled with the families of every mean courtier. But the court was, of course, par excellence, a focus for conspicuous consumption. Emulative spending, such as Botero identified, by preening courtiers to impress the monarch. Of course, the monarch, in a sense, led the way. Elizabeth spends a modest £6,000 or £7,000 a year on the wardrobe. Because that doesn't sound very much to us, but it is actually more than the Crown was extracting from the City of London in direct taxation every year. And what's interesting is that's all being spent back in the city economy. The taxation actually works, the whole system works really very much in favour of these London trades, because they're being basically undertaxed, but the money's being spent there. Under James I, wardrobe expenditure quadruples, partly because he's got a larger family, of course, remember. But the Crown's servants were also spending dizzying sums on dress and display, much of it channeled to these luxury traders, the city's mercers, goldsmiths, jewellers, coachmakers, and the like. So somebody like Lord Robert Dudley, even very early in his career, he's establishing himself as Elizabeth's favourite. In 1559, he's spending £100 a month on clothing. The Duke of Buckingham in the 1620s spent £1,500 in 1623 on apparel, £3,000 in 1627. So this means the court luxury spending is a key driver. John Norden remarked in the 1590s that when the court was absent from the city, the poor people forthwith complain of penury and want, and of a bad and miserable world. Now, another element identified by Botero he talked about the implications of the law courts being in the city, and this is quite important. He wrote, "Cities that have courts of justice must needs be much frequented, as well for concourse of people that have cause of suit unto it, as for the execution of justice. For it cannot be ministered without the help of advocates, proctors, solicitors, notaries, and such like. Nay, more than that, which it grieves me to think on. Expedition of justice cannot be made these our days without ready money." Well, yes, plus ça change. But it is actually quite striking. I mean, well, it's more than striking. It's remarkable. The growth in litigation in the 16th century is measurable. We've got quite good data on this. Let's just take the number of cases in an advanced state in the central common law courts in Westminster. 2,100 cases in 1490. 5,300 in 1560, 13,000 in 1580, 23,000 in 1606, 29,000 in 1640. Huge growth in litigation, and it does of course reflect something of the commercializing economy. It probably also reflects partly the inability of the lawyers to offer any solutions to people's problems. Yes, I know, it's risky, isn't it? But that was then. That was then. It's all very different. But what this means is that one of the key elements of the rhythm of the London economy are the legal terms, the periods when the court is sitting. And I always find it a very interesting fact. We happen to know that the city, because the Lord Mayor tells us in 1573, the city needs 11% more grain during the law terms and out of the law terms. So that's an indication of the extra demand that is being put into the London economy during those periods. And when you look at the household accounts of the gentry, you see them regularly coming up to London to pursue their litigation and hand over all their money to these greedy lawyers. But of course they also come to do their shopping. And moreover, they're increasingly accompanied by their wives, much to the chagrin of James I, who opined in a speech to Star Chamber in 1616 that one of the greatest causes of all gentlemen's desire that have no calling or errands to dwell in London is apparently the pride of women. For if they be wives, then their husbands, and if they be maids, then their fathers, must bring them up to London, because the new fashion is to be had nowhere but London. And this, of course, is at the time when the Crown is trying to, get people out of London. It's trying to get the elite out of London so they can exercise hospitality in the countryside. This is the Crown sort of moving against social trends. And, of course, the social trend is the increased tendency of the elite to reside in London for part of the year. This was Botero's third point. Experience teacheth that the residence of noblemen in cities makes them to be more glorious and more populous, not only because they bring their people and their families unto it, but also more because a nobleman dispendeth much more largely through the access of friends unto him, and through the emulation of others in a city where he is abiding and visited continually by honourable personages, than he spendeth in the country, where he liveth among the brute beasts of the field, and converseth with plain country people, and goes apparelled among them in plain and simple garments. So there's something different about the quality of city living. And it's interesting that it's in the 1570s that you begin to get tracts debating the benefits of residence in the city against residence in the countryside. And Botero's judgment is rather confirmed by this tract, which says that one of the good things about living in London is that one could choose one's dinner guests and have friends at one's dinner table, men of more civility, wisdom, and worth than your rude country gentlemen or rustical neighbours. And the same tract of course, waxes lyrical about the air quality in the suburbs, and there's less noise. There's an abundance of lodgings, spacious and roomy, with gardens and orchards, very delectable. I'm not sure it's quite like that, really. We're going to hear about the pollution later. What we see in the 17th century is a gradual transition in patterns of elite engagement with the capital. In the earlier period, gentry visitors had rented lodgings, often with tradesmen actually, and at pretty exorbitant rates. They now seek out townhouses of their own, where they can decamp with their families during the London season, returning to their estates in the summer. And while in London, they could avail themselves of the capital's culture and leisure facilities, its dancing academies, fencing schools, bowling alleys, theatres, coffee houses later on, and of course its brothels. Gentility in England was increasingly becoming a matter of performance rather than lineage, and London is the theatre in which gentility is performed. Now, the changes in social mores were facilitated by a huge expansion of the fashionable housing stock in what becomes the West End. And this began in the 16th century with a series of property exchanges at the Reformation. The ecclesiastical inns, the properties owned by the bishops and abbots, many of them passed into lay hands and become aristocratic palaces. And the number of resident peers in Westminster rises from about 30 in the 1560s to 90 in the 1630s. But the real transformation occurs after the 1630s, as we see a variety of speculative developments in the West End. And of course, the prototype is the Earl of Bedford's Covent Garden during the 1630s, but it's followed in the 1660s by more of these squares, Bloomsbury being developed by the Earl of Southampton in the 1660s. And then you get speculative builders like Nicholas Barbon, who leases the old Tudor palaces along the Strand and then pulls them down and builds, as it were, cheaper apartments for gentlemen, because what's happening is that the Strand is becoming slightly déclassé, and the aristocrats are moving westwards to Piccadilly, mansions like Burlington House, for example, Grosvenor, Dorchester, Londonderry houses in Park Lane. So the development of the West End, with its fashionable squares, uniform terraces, framing monumental devices, wider streets, that, of course, tends to accentuate the distinction between the West End, the centre of government and residence of the landed elite, and the old city dedicated to commerce and manufacturing. But the face of that old city was also to be transformed by the Great Fire, the most horrid, bloody, malicious flame. The fire destroys 13,000 houses, probably about 65,000 people are rendered homeless. But of course, this is an extraordinary opportunity, not an opportunity they could fully grasp. I mean, there are all these visionary plans for the reformation of the city on classical lines, with a grid plan and all that kind of thing. Well, they couldn't do that because they had to respect existing property rights. But a lot did change, as we can see by looking at sort of images of the old city and comparing them with the new. John Evelyn had described the city a few years before as a wooden northern, that's obviously a dirty word, and meaning Northern Europe, actually, and in artificial congestion. But of course, it's become a city of brick, more uniform terraces and sash windows. And the rebuilding assists in London's claim to be a city of civility. But of course, one of the things that this does is to accentuate the distinction between the commercial core of the city and the suburbs, because one of the effects of the rebuilding is to removed some of the alleys in the central city, which had often been behind the main thoroughfares, and these are now absorbed into more fashionable developments. So what's happening is that social distinctions are being articulated still further. The city core becomes slightly wealthier, while the poor are kind of being pushed into the suburbs. Now, the distinction between the West End and the Old City reminds us of the importance of that other element in London's growth. It's a capital city, it's also a port. And the river is terribly important. As the maps and panoramas make clear, the river's central to the city's sense of its own identity. As Richard Burton put it in 1684, the city owed its glory and riches and many other blessings to that excellent River of Thames. And the river plays a really important role in civic ceremonial, a key role on Lord Mayor's Day, when there's a huge procession of barges from the city to Westminster when the Lord Mayor takes his oath. The river obviously provides the vital artery by which agricultural products move down the Thames to the markets like Queenhithe. And, of course, the river provides the vital connection to the outside world. Now, it's true that already by 1550, London has a dominating position in England's overseas trade. It accounts for nearly 90% of the export of the staple export commodity, cloth. But the point is, the vast majority of that trade runs along what we call the London-Antwerp axis. It's all these manufacturers are going to Antwerp, and London's merchants are buying a combination of luxury commodities and actually basic manufactured goods, bringing them into England. It's kind of easy money for London merchants. And London is very much, I think, a satellite of Antwerp at that date. And it would be true to say that the manufacturing base of London looks pretty weak. This is a matter of grave concern for contemporary commentators who bemoan the fact that England is importing things like looking glasses, hats, mirrors, playing cards, beads and so on. There's a huge argument about the need for import substitution to, as it were, for the English to raise their game. And this also has implications, of course, for London's relationship with the provinces. London's trade is primarily export-led and at this time, and the dynamism really lies in the provincial manufacturers. Londoners are taking advantage of they've got a locational advantage being close to those low country marts. And, of course, they're exploiting their leverage with the Crown, which gives them particular commercial privileges, and is that causes the resentment with the struggling outports. So this dominance of London at that point, I don't think, is necessarily a very positive development in terms of the English economy, and some of the critics of London had good cause. But, of course, this is all to change in the 150 years after 1550, and perhaps emblematic of that is Greshams Royal Exchange, built in the 1560s, but presented by Wenceslas Holler as the sort of emporium of all nations. The engraving by Holler shows a variety of nationalities there, and there are indeed designated walks for different nations. What's interesting about the 17th century, or at least the early 17th century commercial expansion, is that it is import-led. It's luxury products, wine, silks, raisins, currants, peppers, and so on. They account for 43% of London's imports in the 1630s, and that's doubled the proportion that they were in Elizabeth's reign. And this shift from export to import-led commercial expansion means that the dynamic element is in overseas expansion is indeed shifting from the manufacturer to the merchant, who are dependent now on the enterprise of the merchant, scouring the world, as it were, in search of fashionable commodities. London's trading networks are becoming more diversified. Trade no longer concentrates just on northwestern Europe. London's merchants re-enter the Mediterranean in the later years of Elizabeth's reign, and of course from 1600 they establish trade in the East Indies. And you get the very early struggling beginnings of the American colonies, again in the early 17th century. I always like to think of London's first global merchant as being a man called Sir Thomas Smith, who combined the role of being the treasurer of the and a key player in the East India Company with a role with a key role as a promoter of the Virginia Company. You go to Smith's house in Leadenhall in the city in the 16 teens, and you go in and find there's an Inuit canoe hanging from the roof, and you would encounter among his domestic servants a Hottentot and a Native American. This is the kind of, I would think of this kind of first global household in London, but it's a sign of these much broader horizons that there are in the early 17th century. And Smith's career, of course, reminds us that a key factor in London's expansion is, perhaps slightly embarrassingly, the empire. Because the colonial trades, particularly the American and Caribbean colonies, prove to be one of the most, well, they are the most dynamic sector in commerce by the later 17th century. By the 1670s and 80s, there are about 250,000 Englishmen established in North America and the West Indies. That's many more than the Netherlands, which of course had a very low population base, but also many more than the French established. So there's a big English presence, and they're very dependent at this point on English manufactures. £250,000 worth of manufactures is going each year in the 1680s. They've been described as detached suburbs of London at that date. But the other really important thing, of course, is the imports from these colonies, particularly tobacco and sugar. And crucially, very large quantities of tobacco and sugar are being re-exported, and that is a means by which those imported goods can be paid for. So the colonial trades are of vital significance. And by 1700, the re-export of commodities counts for 38% of the total value of exports and re-exports combined. So this is big money for Londoners. And of course, overseas trade brings major spin-offs like shipbuilding. The East India Company docks. I mean, in the years after 1607, the company lays down 15,000 tons of shipping. That's representing a capital investment of about £100,000. And you see very large expansions in the commercial tonnage in the later 17th century. Of course, other spin-off industries would be things like sugar refining and tobacco processing. Now, another effect of the surge of imports was a process of imitation and emulation by native craftsmen, which extended London's manufacturing base. According to James Howell in 1657, it was agreed by all nations that though the Londoners be not so apt to invent, yet when they have got the invention, they use always to improve it and bring it to greater perfection. In other words, the English were rip-off. They took other people's technology. Well, I'm not going to tell you who that might remind you of. You can all draw your own conclusions. But it's definitely that English take other people's technology and do it a bit more cheaply. And an example of this would be Indian textiles in the 17th century. There's huge imports of chintzes, these cloths from India, about 1 million pieces a year coming in from India by the 1670s, much to the chagrin of domestic producers. And this has all been controlled by the East India Company, is controlling the kind of the kind of designs that are being produced by the Indian craftsmen. But the English respond with their own, as it were, cheaper imitations, using block printing rather than painting. And this means that their stuff is cheaper and more immediately adaptable to changing tastes. And you can see this kind of process of imitation in other trades, like glassmaking. English glass is kind of imitating Venetian glass. It's not really as good, but it kind of looks plausible. Ceramic, so pottery was another example. An awful lot of pottery had been imported in the 16th century, but in the later 17th century you begin to get potteries in Chelsea and Vauxhall that are highly competitive with those imports. So London, it's difficult to think back London as a manufacturing city, but that is what it is in the later 17th century. It's a major centre of manufacturing. Both as a result of import substitution and as a result of increasing specialisation in several industries, where London takes on a finishing role of commodities that might be started in the provinces. Now, this rising manufacturing output is underpinned by a growth in consumer demand. Recent estimates suggest that gross domestic product actually doubled in the 17th century, partly as a result of this commercial expansion. Of course, because population is stagnating in the later 17th century, that means that national incomes per head are rising, and that could release more consumer demand. London obviously had an inegalitarian social structure. Its government was dominated by an elite of plutocrats, but it was probably not as sharply polarised as some assume. Contemporaries tell us that those of the middle station be most numerous. So there's a kind of thickened group in the middle who might constitute the basis for a consumer demand. And as regards the workers, there may well have been a retreat from the leisure preference in the later 17th century, as people, as it were, work harder to obtain the new consumer goods. What's been dubbed by one historian, Jan de Vries, as the industrious revolution. Certainly, some of the early political economists thought that. Here's Nicholas Barbon, the builder. Emulation provokes a continued industry and will not allow no intervals or be ever satisfied. The cobbler is always endeavouring to live as well as a shoemaker, and the shoemaker as well as any in the parish. So every neighbour and every artisan is endeavouring to outvie each other, and all men by a perpetual industry are struggling to mend their former condition, and thus the people grow rich, which is a great advantage of a nation. So this is a kind of new discourse of the 1670s and 1680s. It's very different from the kind of attitude you've got in the 16th century, where all these kind of behaviours would have been presented as covetousness, human greed. Emulation is now being celebrated. Consumption is being celebrated as a positive good, as positive economic good. And the effect of this, as it were, industriousness is shown through investment in consumer goods. So we know this through looking at probate inventories, where people list their goods. 60% of London inventories by 1725 include the paraphernalia of tea and coffee making, as opposed to 6% in the countryside. And with growing consumption comes the proliferation of shops. The number of shops is so great, and indeed so far beyond that of any foreign city, that it is to strangers a just matter of amazement, comments one foreign visitor in the 1690s. London, of course, has the first shopping arcades in the Royal Exchange, and again in the New Exchange in Westminster, but it's also got increasingly these fashionable shops with glass fronts, and its traders are using sophisticated advertising techniques. So this emphasis on, as it were, on a virtuous spiral of economic activity does beg the question how it was that London was able to take the lead over competitors. And I provided a partial answer, but I think we have to engage, as contemporaries did, in some international comparisons. One of the problematic questions is how is it that London beat Amsterdam in trade? Because Amsterdam was the great success story of the early 17th century. By the later 17th century, the Dutch have fallen into relative decline. And this is a very difficult question. I'm not sure we really have a full answer. And if I was doing a full answer, I'd have to look at things like relative tax rates, because I think that is an element that the Dutch are suffering from the burden of really pretty continuous warfare in the later 17th century. Of course, England's success is a matter of catch-up as the English imitate their Republican rivals. There's a major shift in public discourse over the course of the 17th century as the language of improvement becomes increasingly pervasive. The notion that the application of human ingenuity could lead to increased wealth. And these kind of discussions are always accompanied by international comparisons. Why is it that the Dutch are better than us? How can we maximise the potential of our trade? How can we maximise the labour of our people? These are the questions that are being asked in the later 17th century. And trade is seen as central to the generation of wealth. Although the English Parliament is dominated by landowners, they all knew that trade was the vitals of the nation. As Peter Pett put it in 1688, the passion for trade and navigation had infected the whole kingdom, and no man disdains to marry or mix with it. It's a distinctive feature of the English social system that, because there isn't primogeniture, many of the younger sons of the landed elite go into trade, and that kind of smooths some of the tensions between them. And England is, the French note this, that England is a nation of would-be political economists. Its coffee houses are full of chatter about government revenue and the course of trade, and this kind of thing. That's what the French say when they come in. They're puzzled by it. Everybody's talking about trade. Because it's not enough to... People are talking about it, but how do things get done? How do they influence government policy? And I think there it's important to think about the ways in which political structures are changing over the course of the 17th century. This is perhaps slightly more controversial judgment. The English polity after the Glorious Revolution becomes a parliamentary monarchy. And this means that the privileges of the monopoly trading companies, which had distorted earlier economic development, are subject to greater scrutiny through, as it were, annual parliaments, which also mean that the lobbyists for different interest groups are able to ply their cases. Economic policy is, I'm not trying to say it's been conducted in a rational manner, because it certainly wasn't. There was a lot of idiotic argument going on. But the point is that economic discussion is there in the public sphere. There is a great deal of genuine debate over it. So shifts in the terms of public discourse and the political framework in which decisions about the economy were taken may have facilitated English growth. But it's also worth thinking, don't worry, I'm coming to a close round soonish, it's worth thinking about some of the structural economic differences between England and the Low Countries and some of its competitors. And actually, central to this is, again, there are always contemporary resonances for this, is energy costs. So, because, as you know, the key to the English economic breakthrough in the 18th century was it escaped the constraints of the organic economy by recourse to mineral resources of energy, coal. But the beginnings of that transition to a coal-based economy were very evident in London in the early modern period. It's as early as about 1570 that London switches from wood to coal as its primary fuel. And that's because coal can be shipped cheaply from Newcastle. Coal consumption in the capital grows 15 times between 1580 and 1700. And as Derek Keynes pointed out, the use of sea coal gives London advantages over the other European metropolises. It freed the territory in the vicinity of the capital of the necessity to produce wood fuel, which meant you could use the land around the city for more productive uses. It endows London with a virtually unlimited source of energy to support its physical growth and continued industrial production, and it facilitates the reconstruction of the city in brick after the fire. But this point is reinforced if we contrast London with the Low Countries. Now, the Dutch Golden Age has its big industries, like heat-intensive industries like brewing, dyeing, and glassmaking. But, of course, in the Low Countries, the fuel is peat, relatively easily transported by the Dutch canal system, but a resource which is much more finite and less energy-intensive than coal. It's been estimated that the Dutch exhausted between 3 and 5% of the available peat reserves each decade in the 17th century. Is becoming more expensive. And, of course, a ton of peat produces only about half the amount of energy as a ton of coal. So England in 1700, we are told, was producing about 3 times the heat equivalent of the Dutch peat beds. So the per capita energy output of the English economy is ahead of the Dutch. So we're in this transition stage already from an economy based on organic raw materials. A transition to an economy moving to an economy based on inorganic raw materials, harnessing the stored energy of past millennia. And incidentally, this means that London is, by 1700, the most polluted city in the world. Evelyn spoke of such a cloud of sea coal as there be a resemblance of hell on earth. The capital's buildings are blackened by the unmerciful smoke of coal fires. It's been estimated that London regularly exceeded the levels of sulfur dioxide deemed safe, and by 1725, it's estimated that levels of particulate matter in its atmosphere, it's because actually the type of coal they're using is particularly bad, polluted. The levels of particulates were greater than any city in the world in 2004, apart from Delhi. But if England had low energy costs, it also had high labour costs. And really here I'm cribbing, and I'm not sure I 100% believe this, but it is a very interesting argument. The economic historian Robert Allen has shown that by the later 17th century, English labour costs relative to potential competitors in the rest of Europe, but also potential global competitors, that is China and India, that English labour costs are very high and that energy costs are very low in global terms. And those high wages reflect the fact that there's higher per capita trade than elsewhere. So the combination of this circumstance with low energy costs is crucial because it gives the English incentives to apply ways of harnessing energy to reduce costs. You know, the English have to make more effective use of their labour if they're going to keep up. Another element of the high wage economy is that it generates the income necessary to purchase higher levels of education and training. So literacy and numeracy levels are much higher in England in 1700 than in 1550. And the greater resort to apprenticeship in England means that there's considerable investment in craft skill, thereby developing social capital, contributing to the development of what's been called the knowledge economy. Now, the problem with this argument is, of course, that a lot of this stuff really happens in the 18th century. But, of course, historians are seeing the industrial and technological change in this period as much more sort of evolutionary than revolutionary, kind of smoothing out the chronology of change. And that means these 17th century foundations are becoming more important. And remember this point that I've made already, that contemporaries are noting the English tendency to take foreign inventions and work them up and do them more cheap. So de Saussure comments that in the 1720s that the English are finishing most admirably what the French and Germans have invented. Remember that the settlement of Huguenot refugees in England in the later 17th century involves significant technology transfers, which are applied to crafts like watch and clock making, paper manufacture, textile printing, and so forth. The first high-tech pin factory opens in London in 1692. Engine looms for the production of silk ribbons become more common after the Restoration. It's claimed that one man with an engine loom can do more work in a day than 10 men with looms without engines. So the high-wage economy incentivizes the adoption of new technologies. So I'll finish. We started with the question of the degree to which London's relationship with the economy was parasitic or stimulatory. One can see, I think, how a parasitic relationship was present at the beginning of our period. London's dominance rested on the privileged position of its trading companies, using their greater leverage with the Crown to weaken provincial rivals. But the situation in the later 17th century, I hope I've shown, was very different. It seems that international trade was the key variable in London's greater dynamism, boosting national income and setting off this virtuous spiral of innovation and improvement. And there I finish. Well, how are we doing to this? You've got a microphone. All right, okay, and one there. So, well, this very talkative person. Yes.
Well, this talkative person is Christine.
Oh, hello.
Ian, that was quite brilliant. The danger of being both brilliant and a treasure is you'd like to be put on display at the Tower of London, which is a fate worse than modern. But before that happens, I want to run past you a serious aphorism you're collecting. And it's one from Steve Norris that says, "He who is tired of London is tired of looking for a parking place." And it is a serious point. I want to put it past you that the absolute determinant on the size of London is the ability to transport its population.
Yes, well, transport is a major problem, of course, because you've got massive issues about traffic congestion. Early on, the complaints about the stuff you get on Hackney coaches and their problems are massive. Because they do have, as it were, systems for one-way streets at quite an early date. Those Thameside quays are regulated early on. And obviously the river acts as a major, I suppose, relief point on congestion, because there are, in the early 17th century, there are probably 3,000 watermen being employed. I think the other element, though, is that we do have to think about, and I didn't talk about this at all, but the infrastructure, transport infrastructure in England, which it does look like, again, you see, we have all these stereotypes of how dreadful 17th century roads are, because, of course, it's the 18th century that has all the turnpikes, makes everything better. But actually, if you look at things like the development of carrying services, which we can quantify, you see that between the 1630s and 1680s, there's a massive expansion in the number of services, regular services, linking London with provincial towns. So there is an increase in capacity early on, and you do get, as it were, quite modest road routes. And you've got, travel speeds are going up. You can get those flying coaches, mean you can get from Oxford to London in a day by the later 17th century. That's quite a change from earlier on. So, yeah, I think transport is a key variable here. And, of course, the other thing is being able to transport goods into London. The Thames, again, has the fact that you can bring these commodities by water does have the effect of reducing the costs. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you very much. Keith Best, 1967, so just off the deceased list, just short of it. I'm not a historian by practice, although I'm very much an amateur one. I studied law, but we live at the present time when we're told that the matter that exercises the British electorate most is immigration. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the Huguenots and the Edict of Nantes and the fact that London has benefited so much from that. Could you say just a little bit more about just how much, I don't know if you're able to quantify in any way, the net benefit to London of that migration flow, not just of ideas, but also of people bringing skills with them and things of that nature?
No, I couldn't quantify it, but it is clearly important. I mean, there is I think sometimes we get it a little bit wrong, because, of course, there is migration both ways across the North Sea. There are quite a lot of English people in the Netherlands too, and that's quite, and they're learning stuff while they're there. So I think we have to think of these flows going in two directions, and we tend to think it's typical, isn't it, that we think of it all being that they all come over here. But, and again, we think of the Huguenots, but it is a longer-term development, because he went back to the Elizabeth's reign. The transformation in the textile industries in the early 17th century is down to the adoption of these lighter fabrics that are more easily vendable in the southern markets, and that's due to adaptation of skills brought again by the wave of immigrants that come in Elizabeth's reign and the persecutions of Elizabeth's reign. And that actually, that change was crucial to the economics because the broadcloth industry was in quite serious trouble. There was a massive restructuring in the early 17th century in the textile trade, and had it not been for the adoption of those alien skills, it would have happened. But it's partly that they get it's partly that they adapt them. It's not just the aliens who do it. There is an interaction with native skill and process of adaptation. So it would be quite hard to, as it were, isolate the sort of alien variable. But I certainly want to look a lot more closely at this process. I mean, it's really good at this process of innovation in the later 17th century. I gave a few examples there. And actually, as I was writing, I was thinking, gosh, I wish I had more, because I suddenly thought, well, this labour-saving thing is quite interesting. How many more cases can we find? And I mean, I'll admit to feeling a bit thin on that. Yeah, hi. Well, I don't know. Jenny, are you in charge of this, or am I?
You're on the and I'm
Oh, right.
Hello, I'm Ben Webster. I studied English at Keble in the end of the 1980s. I'm now environment editor of the Times. But it's very interesting to hear your lecture because it relates to something I was actually writing about today, which was the issue of climate change and how much Britain should contribute relative to other countries to the Green Climate Fund. And it's actually all based on historical responsibility. Yes. And so I was fascinated to hear what you said about how much London's growth and London's wealth, and I'm assuming the wealth of a lot of people in this room, including me, is related to the burning of coal during that period. I mean, would it be fair to go as far as to say that London's wealth of any city in the world is more linked to the burning of coal than perhaps any other city in the world?
That probably is a sustainable position. It's when you say you're a journalist. It rather makes one feel. I've now forgotten the article. There is this article which does do that stuff about pollution levels in 70. It's all based on modelling how much coal London was, as it were, consuming in 1700, and looking at the type of coal that it was, and modelling what kind of pollution might have come out of that. And there is a sort of historic run of data, and that's where you would go to get the data which would substantiate that claim and enable you to make the international comparisons. And yes, perhaps it would mean that the city would have to cough up for its share of responsibility. But yeah, it's very... The fuel thing is... I think the problem with my argument is that it really becomes important in the 18th century because that combination of of low energy costs and high wage costs, that's what's fueling those technological innovations of the 18th century, and that's where you can really see the shift. But I wouldn't want to. I'm not going to be drawn further than that.
Carl Garner, Keble, yes, that's right, theology in 1963. Mm-hmm. This isn't a theological question. I'm very interested in the immigration impact, which was picked up over here, because I think that in this period you've not just got the Huguenots. You've also got, in the beginning of James's reign, the so-called Huguenots from when James I had part of the Spanish Netherlands in caution. And some quite rich families came over then and were involved, I think, in arming the new model army and explosives and interesting things. And then, of course, the Jews, the Sephardi Jews being allowed in from Amsterdam in under Cromwell and then confirmed by Charles. And perhaps that's part of why, again, and further reason why London grew and the Netherlands and the Lowlands didn't quite. Yeah,
I think there is a lot in that. If you look at the composition of the London merchant community, who are the people who are in charge of London's trade? In the early 16th century, there was actually quite a strong foreign component. There's a lot of Venetians, Florentines, there's a lot of Hanseatic merchants. They get squeezed out over the course of Elizabeth's reign, and a lot of it's to do with the way in which the merchant adventurers use their... Gresham uses his inroads with the crown to, as it were, well, the deal is that if the merchant adventurers collaborate with Gresham's dodgy loan schemes and manipulations of the exchange rate, then the crown will clobber the foreign merchants, sort of thing. So there's a kind of a deal. And the result is that you see a retreat of foreign merchants in that period. But the 17th century, if you look at London in the 1690s, it's now got a very much more diversified mercantile community, and there are a lot of Jewish merchants and foreign merchants. Again, I can't quite give you the figures, but it's actually very striking. It's a very different complexion from the kind of community you had in the early 17th century. It's much more cosmopolitan merchant community than you had earlier on. So yeah, that's a good point.
Roger Sainsbury, 1959. I read engineering, and from that perspective, I'd like to follow up on the first question about infrastructure. When was the second bridge built? And hypothetically, how much better would London have been if a second bridge had been built 100 years earlier?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. There was a plan for a second bridge in the I think it's the early 80s, 1680s. The interesting thing is the city, those wise men of the city who surround us, opposed it. You know, it was about that they feared the competition of the rest of the rest of London. So it's not till Westminster Bridge, mid-18th century, that you get another bridge, and until then, a lot of the crossing at Westminster was by these horse ferries that move across. So it's. I must admit, that is one of those areas where the attitude of the city could be regarded as being obstructive and retarding growth. I mean, one thing that, of course, isn't clear from what I've said is just what a political mess London is in this period. That there's no... Well, that won't surprise you, because, again, it's all very familiar that that what I've called the sort of city proper, the old city, is governed by the corporation, but Westminster has completely separate institutions, and these eastern suburbs are run through manorial institutions. So you end up with a pretty anarchic political system. And there's a question about how functional or dysfunctional that is. Actually, I'm willing to argue that it's a bit more functional than one might think. But on the point about the bridge, yeah, I think London's attitude does can be regarded as pretty reactionary and retardative, if that's a word.
Thank you very much, Ray Bowden, from the 60s. I had to admit that I was sitting here thinking you were playing with us and describing modern London in a 17th century idiom. So many parallels came out. The thing that caught my attention is your comment about the lack of awareness of the big cities in the East, in Japan, and or lack of comment on it. Was there an awareness of that? There was an awareness of the trade, but there was awareness of the civilization. And if I can extrapolate that, when I learned history in school, the Far East didn't exist. It was all European history. And I'm wondering whether you're finding the freshers coming up now are much more aware of what was happening at the same time as this in London.
Yeah, they do mention these cities. They do increasingly. They haven't been there, but they're aware of them. And some of them will acknowledge that they are bigger, but they won't. But they say very little about the nature of them. So most of the debate is conducted in terms, well, as you would have gathered, in terms of where London stands relative to Paris and Naples. So it's a very limited engagement at least in the 17th century. Even though the discourse is one of international comparisons, it's international comparisons within the Western world. I mean, there is a bigger question that I've ducked, which is this isn't my area at all. I know there would be people in the room better qualified, but one of the questions is why. The bigger question is, as it were, why Northwestern Europe versus China. China had all these positive qualities, or that, you know, the knowledge economy was much higher, its levels of manufacturing and skill and all the rest of it were much higher. But of course, it doesn't do the trade. The trade is the key variable. They have those. If you go to that exhibition on the Ming, of course, you see all those wonderful trading expeditions in the early 15th century, but then they stop, arguably for ideological reasons, that it's about limiting social mobility. But you know, that's one of the big differences. As I put, you know, I'm emphasising this commercial variable, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing it, because that would be that's a variable that helps explain the divergence between some of these northwestern European economies and some of the Asiatic economies, which had massive potential in them.
Hi. Just a quick question. As far as politics was concerned, was London ever considered a problem city, to the extent that were social tensions ever an issue for the ruling elite?
Always. Actually, in a way, I'm much more interested in that question than I am in this economic stuff, because that's what I first... You can read my first book. It's all about... which is all about that. I mean, they're terribly anxious about what lies beneath, and I've written in terms of them sort of walking on the crust of a volcano in a decade like the 1590s. But what's interesting is that there is relatively little disorder that is directed at the elite. I mean, there's a lot of disorder, you know, a lot of disorder directed at foreigners and Catholics and all that kind of stuff. But there's not that much disorder which you can say, God, there are a lot of rich people and, you know, let's hang the bastards, sort of thing. There's a bit of that, but it's not, because it does seem that, I mean, my argument is that there are quite a lot of mechanisms for the amelioration of grievances within the system. The guilds work pretty effectively at, as it were, managing artisan, managing. It's not meeting them, it's management, it's containing. Because, and guilds spend masses of money, lobbying in Parliament, well, against aliens, you see, that's one of the key things. For discriminatory legislation, and fighting competitors in the law courts. But the fact that there are these, as it were, legal mechanisms of doing it, kind of keeps people off the streets. So there is a sense in which one of the distinctive features of the English political culture is this kind of, if you like, the legalism of it, that people will use legal mechanisms to deal with grievances rather than, as it were, rioting on the street. So all these means of containment. And of course, the welfare system is another element of the picture, that you get a pretty elaborate scheme of social welfare developing in the course of the 17th century. Not necessarily desperately effective, but again, it becomes one of those mechanisms you've got to manage the poor. So it's quite complicated, and that's a very brief answer. But what I'm saying is, I think there are tensions, but they are kind of, and people aren't necessarily happy. But there are ways in which tensions can be contained.
I think one more. Sorry. May I ask about? May I ask about population growth? You mentioned, of course, it became a much more cosmopolitan city, but you also mentioned in an earlier point that population growth did not rely on natural increase; it relied on immigration from within the British area. And I wondered how long this went on for. My understanding, for example, is that the majority of recruits into the Metropolitan Police didn't come from London until the 1880s.
Oh, really? I'm not sure. I can't... Yeah, I don't know anything about... I don't do the 19th century.
I have to declare an interest. I trained, as some of you know, as a historian myself originally, so that's the classic get-out clause. Not his period. But on your period, Ian, all I will say is I think we've had a gem this evening, and I hope you'll all share with me a really rapturous round of applause.